Greetings and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. My name is Gennady Stoliarov II, and I am the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party. Here we hold conversations with some of the world's leading thinkers in longevity, science, technology, philosophy, and politics. Like the philosophers of the Age of Enlightenment, we aim to connect every field of human endeavor and arrive at new insights to achieve longer lives, greater rationality, and the progress of our civilization. Greetings and welcome to our U.S. Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon of April 9th, 2023. Today we have a twofold presentation for you on AI for medical imaging and personalized medicine, as well as research into long COVID. And joining us is a panel of our U.S. Transhumanist Party officers, including our Director of Visual Art and current Vice Chairman, Art Ramon Garcia, and our Legislative Director, Jason Geringer. Our guest today, who will be presenting, is Dr. Dan Elton, who is the U.S. Transhumanist Party Director of Scholarship. Dan Elton received a Bachelor of Science degree in physics from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in 2009 and a Ph.D. in physics from Stony Brook University in 2016. He has been the USTP's Director of Scholarship since 2020, and he has been interested and involved in transhumanism since at least 2009, when he joined the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute Transhumanist Club. He is a member on several boards of the Lifeboat Foundation, and he is also a contributor and proponent of H+pedia, the Transhumanist Wiki. You can find his website at moreisdifferent.com, and his Twitter handle is moreisdifferent. He also has a blog at moreisdifferent.substack.com. All of these resources will be posted both in the video description and throughout the course of this salon. So thank you very much, Dan, and please feel free to begin with your first presentation.
Okay, thanks, Gennady. Can you guys see it? Okay. So the title of this is how not to waste your medical images. And this is based off of a TEDx talk that I gave a few weeks ago here in Boston. The TEDx talk was only 5 minutes, but this is going to be a little bit longer, and I'm going to go over some more of my research that I did while I was at the National Institutes of Health. So when people think of AI for medical imaging, they often think of AI replacing radiologists. But like I've discussed in my on one of my Substack posts, I think we're actually a long way from AI replacing radiologists. What I've been interested in is how AI can augment the practice of radiology and fill in the gaps that exist in the way radiology is currently done. So one of the big issues in radiology today is the radiologists are really overworked. The number of CT scans and MRI scans being taken is growing exponentially, and the resolution of these scans is also increasing over time. So there's more and more images to analyze in these 3D scans. As a result, typically radiologists only spend about 10 to 20 minutes per scan. And because they are only liable for detecting gross abnormalities or diseases like cancer, that tends to be the focus. There's very little effort put into identifying risk factors. And when risk factors are found, such as plaque or types of visceral fat, they're often not noted. And then if they are noted in the radiology report, that information may never actually make it to the patient because the doctor may just ignore it. So this is where I think AI can really improve things in radiology by essentially identifying risk factors for preventative medicine. While I was at the National Institutes of Health, I worked on several tools for automated extraction of biomarkers from abdominal CT scans. So we developed a suite of 5 tools that measure what we call body composition biomarkers from any abdominal CT scan. So these tools can work on basically any CT scan that's taken that contains the abdomen. And so using these measurements from these tools, we can give we could provide personalized health recommendations to patients. What we can do is for each of these measurements, we can compare the measurements to a distribution of measurements for the average population in that person's age and gender cohort. And then we can identify outliers and provide personalized health recommendations. So, for instance, we might notice that a patient has abnormally low bone mineral density for their age. And then we could tell the patient, you should consider taking a bone mineral density supplement, such as calcium or boron or strontium. We can also use these biomarkers to predict things like your 5-year survival probability or 10-year survival probability. And what's interesting here is that using these biomarkers, we can get a much better prediction of survival than conventional risk scoring methods. So one of the conventional scoring systems that's used for predicting survival and also predicting cardiovascular disease risk is called the Framingham Risk Score. And this takes into account your cholesterol, whether you smoke, and a few other factors. Using these biomarkers, we can actually get a much better prediction of your 5-year survival and your cardiovascular disease risk. These plots are called ROC plots. I don't really have time to explain these, but basically for each of these measurements, you set some sort of threshold where you say, if you're above this value, then I'm going to predict that you're going to have cardiovascular disease in the next 5 years, for instance. So as you vary this threshold, your accuracy doing this prediction increases, or your sensitivity, but you can also get more false positives. So basically, these graphs are showing the trade-off between getting sensitivity, which is true positives, and false positives. And so if you were just guessing with a coin flip whether someone was going to survive the next 5 years, basically you would get something along this diagonal. And as you improve your prediction, you get something that's closer to this upper left-hand corner. So anyway, what we see here basically is that just the measurement of aortic calcification, which is how much plaque you have in your aorta, does a better job at predicting 5-year survival than the Framingham Risk Score. We also see, interestingly, that BMI is not useful at all for this prediction. Now, and we can discuss why that is. But here is a visualization that some collaborators at the University of Wisconsin developed that basically shows the output of all 5 AI tools. So what we see here is basically a particular slice of the body, which is at the L1 vertebra. And then superimposed on this, we see the subcutaneous fat in blue, the visceral fat in yellow, muscle in red. And then this green oval is where we do a bone mineral density measurement inside the vertebra. And then here in yellow, you can see a little bit of plaque, which is in the patient's aorta. On the right, we see what's called a maximal intensity projection. And basically, this shows the liver in brown, the spleen in orange, and then the plaque that was found in the aorta is shown in yellow. So basically, this overlay is something that would be shown to the clinician, which basically allows them to verify that the AI tools ran correctly. And this will, increase trust in the system, and also allow them to identify any abnormalities or errors that might have occurred. This is another deep learning model that I developed, which is called an autoencoder model. And this model is just a single model that takes a 3D abdominal CT scan, and then it just analyzes that scan and directly predicts either your cardiovascular disease risk in the next 10 years or your chance of survival in the next 10 years. The accuracy achieved by this model is very similar to the accuracy achieved using the combination of the 5 models I showed before. The benefit of this model is that it runs much faster, and it doesn't require as much GPU memory. Disadvantage of this model is it's not interpretable, so it's basically a black box model. Whereas these 5 biomarkers are basically pretty understandable. So in addition, I talked about the importance of the plaque in the aorta. Another important biomarker for cardiovascular disease prediction or survival prediction is how much visceral fat you have versus how much subcutaneous fat. And this is not very well captured by the BMI measurement, because people can have different distributions of visceral and subcutaneous fat. Sometimes this is called body habitus. People talk about 2 different types of body habitus. So in the top, you see an apple-shaped body habitus. This sort of body habitus has a lot of visceral fat, as shown in blue, and very little subcutaneous fat. And this is considered very dangerous from a longevity perspective. On the bottom, you see what's called a pear-shaped body habitus. This person has a huge amount of subcutaneous fat and lesser amounts of the visceral fat. So basically, using these deep learning AI models, we can segment out this fat, subcutaneous and visceral fat, and get a precise measurement of how much of each the person has. This sort of measurement would be very time consuming to do manually, so it's almost never done. But these AI tools could easily just run in the background and do this automatically. This is another example where researchers were looking at what's called a DEXA scan, which is a type of X-ray scan, and they were able to predict 10-year mortality just on the basis of this scan. The nice thing about these DEXA scans is they have very little radiation involved. They tried to interpret this model to understand like where the body was looking, but the results were a little bit unclear. I'm going to continue talking about cardiovascular disease risk a little bit, and then I'll go on to some other stuff. So it's been argued that 90% of heart attacks are preventable. The number of heart attacks that occur has already come down about, or the chance of getting a heart attack has already come down about 50% since 1950 due to better education around risk factors like smoking and diet. But doctors believe that if further interventions were implemented at an early enough time, 90% of heart attacks today could be prevented. Part of the reason they believe this is from a study which is called the Pathobiological Determinants of Atherosclerosis in Youth study. This was a study in the 1990s on people aged 15 to 34 who had died of accidents, suicides, or homicides. And what they did was they did autopsies of these people, and they looked in their coronary arteries to see if they were developing any sort of plaques. And they found plaques, specifically in fatty plaques, in about 10 to 15% of these people. And what's interesting is there was a bimodal distribution of plaque. So typically, this is something you see a lot when looking at the amount of plaque people have. People generally have either no plaque or they have a large amount. There's sort of, whenever you look at like a distribution of across lots of people of how much plaque they have, it's generally always bimodal. And this is believed to be due to genetic risk factors, but they don't really understand it very well. Well, so what they found in this study was that, as I said, about 13% of patients or people had quite a large amount of fatty plaque. And they found that whether they had this plaque or not was not very well correlated with traditional risk factors like HDL or LDL and cholesterol or BMI. So this kind of shows that we need to move beyond these traditional risk factors. Ideally, we would be using medical imaging. So for instance, from a CT scan, you can measure the plaque either in the heart or the aorta. If you have plaque in your aorta, you're very likely to have plaque in your heart and vice versa. And we can also get some rough measurements of plaque from MRI scans as well. And so using medical imaging, we can identify teenagers essentially that have the beginnings of fatty plaque. And then theoretically, we could implement interventions to slow or reverse the plaque progression. And as I said, I think a lot of researchers think if something like this is implemented, 90% of heart attacks could be prevented. So I'm going to talk a little bit about interventions. I haven't researched this stuff in detail, but basically what I found was that there's not a lot of good research that just telling someone they're high risk is going to lead to lifestyle change. The Cochrane collaboration did a pretty extensive review, and they found that interventions using counseling or education aimed at behavior change do not reduce total or cardiovascular disease, mortality, or clinical events in general populations, but they may be effective in high-risk populations. So I think we have to think beyond just, telling people, hey, you're at high risk. I think that might help some people, but it's not going to really have a huge effect at reducing cardiovascular disease. There are some medications that seem to be useful, like metformin, low-dose aspirin, and then there's a new class of medications that's being investigated, which are called exogenous exerkines. These are essentially compounds or cytokines that are generated during exercise. So the idea here is to basically mimic the effects of exercise biochemically by basically injecting these agents exogenously. This is a very new field of research, and one of my friends at the University of Albany is looking into this. And then, of course, there's gene therapies that are under development. One of the most well-known is the PCSK9 gene therapy, which is under development by Verve Therapeutics. This is a gene therapy that targets the liver and reduces the I think it's the LDL cholesterol, if I'm remembering correctly. So this is very exciting. Let's see. So there's another slide I wanted to discuss, which seems to be missing, but one of the other things that I wanted to discuss, which is missing from the presentation, is DEXA scans. So DEXA scan is a scan that's typically taken for measuring bone mineral density. It has the amount of radiation of 2 chest X-ray scans, so it's a very small amount of radiation. And researchers at Verily Life Sciences have found that you can actually measure how much plaque you have in your aorta using these DEXA scans. So they developed a deep learning model that will actually segment the plaque in the DEXA scan. And this is something that's currently not being done at all. It could be done, but I think because of the time constraints radiologists are operating under, they're just not doing it. So I had a picture of that, but unfortunately it seemed to have gone missing. So now I'll just talk about some of the other work I did while I was at the NIH. A lot of the work I did was on automated bone mineral density measurement in CT scans. So we developed some software that basically will identify a particular vertebra called the L1 vertebra, and then it will place this cylindrical region of interest inside the vertebra, and it will measure the bone mineral density. So using this, we can identify people that are have early stages of osteoporosis. We can also track bone mineral density over time if people had multiple scans. And then we can also do what's called frailty risk assessment or fracture risk assessment. by combining the measurement of bone mineral density with the measurement of muscle density, we can basically predict how likely someone is to get a fracture. So this is a case study where there was a 59-year-old woman who received a CT scan for colorectal cancer screening. And what you can see in the CT was that she had very low bone mineral density, and she had very low muscle density. And 3 months later, she actually fractured part of her hip. So again, we can use these measurements to basically warn people that they're at high risk for fractures, and then hopefully they would avoid doing, like, you know, skydiving or something dangerous where they might get a fracture. Another thing I worked on was automated measurement of compression fractures. And compression fractures are often missed by radiologists. Part of the reason is that a lot of times you need to look at this sort of side view to see them. And it sounds kind of silly, but a lot of radiologists, like, because they're so busy, they're so rushed, they don't really look at these side view, which is also called sagittal view. And so here on the left is the output from software that I worked on at NIH, which can identify compression fractures. And then on the right, we see output from software developed by Zebra Medical Imaging, which is an Israeli startup, which can basically automatically detect the compression fractures. Another system which I've used is called the Total Segmentator. This is a open source deep learning model that can segment 104 different structures. And so basically, using this model, we can get volume measurements of all these different structures. And these sort of volume measurements would be very time consuming to do manually. This is a visualization of the output of the Total Segmentator, which I developed here at my current job. This is a model I developed at NIH, which basically automatically segments the liver into 9 different regions, or wait, seven different regions. And so the liver looks very homogeneous, but it can actually be separated into 7 different subregions based on the arteries that are feeding into it. And by looking at the relative volumes of these different regions, we can actually diagnose cirrhosis of the liver. And we can also categorize the severity of the cirrhosis into standard reference categories. This work was featured on the cover of Radiology Artificial Intelligence, which is one of the premier journals in radiology. This is other work I was involved in at NIH, where I developed a deep learning model to segment the liver. And using this model, we can measure the density of the liver and how much fat you have in your liver. So we can use this to diagnose fatty liver disease or steatosis of the liver. We can also do volume measurements of the liver and the spleen. And using these, we can identify abnormally large livers, which is a condition called hepatomegaly. And this is interesting because the way that this is currently done is they do this sort of linear measurement. because they're so time constrained, they don't really have time to do a volume measurement. But we showed that the volume measurement is actually better for diagnosing this condition than just like trying to do a linear measurement. And there's a similar story for the spleen as well. Like the volume measurement is more diagnostically useful than this linear measurement. This is additional work I was involved in. That was where I developed a model for pancreas segmentation. And then there was a post-bac fellow who analyzed all this data, and they determined there are certain features of the pancreas that are associated with diabetes risk. So essentially, by analyzing different features of the pancreas, we can predict how likely someone is to get diabetes. It's not very accurate, to be honest, but this is sort of like the first ever time this has been demonstrated. So generally speaking, what you see is that people who have diabetes, they tend to have smaller pancreases, and also the surface of the pancreas becomes more rough, and it has these sort of undulations in it. And also the pancreas tends to have more fat infiltrating into it. So using those sort of biomarkers, we can roughly predict whether someone's going to develop diabetes, say, in 5 years or 10 years. This is another thing which I'm actually quite passionate about, which is kidney stone quantification and monitoring. So kidney stones are very easy to detect because they're basically very just bright spots. But currently the volume of the kidney stones is generally not measured. However, using deep learning, we can identify these kidney stones and automatically measure their volume, and then we can track changes in volume over time. So here we're seeing changes in volume over time. And it's worth noting that these CT scans are very low dose scans, so they have very low amounts of radiation. They're very noisy. So sometimes it's actually hard to see the kidney stone in these scans. But the deep learning model I developed basically will segment the kidney stones, and then the volume can be tracked over time. So this is extremely useful because then you can see whether the kidney stone is growing or shrinking, and you can see whether different therapies are working or not. And right now they just use linear measurements, but there's a lot of research showing that these volume measurements are really superior in a lot of ways. So basically, in summary, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit here for deep learning in radiology. I talked about the biomarkers and risk prediction. I talked a little bit about catching things that radiologists miss. And then, of course, deep learning could be used to help with cancer screening. But the reality is that hospitals have been very slow to deploy these sort of AI systems. Part of that is because they lack the expertise. And then another part of it is that they don't really know how to pay for these things. So that's why I like to propose a different model for which will allow patients to access AI services much faster. And so basically what I'm proposing here is that patients request a copy of their scans, which they have the right to under HIPAA regulations. And then in the future, patients will be able to upload their scans to AI services that are running in the cloud. And I think this is an alternate funding model for startups that are working on AI in radiology. And so for any startups that are working on AI in radiology, I recommend they pursue both deployment in hospitals and make their systems available in the cloud online for any patient to use. That's it. So thanks for listening. I'll take any questions.
All right. Thank you very much, Dan, for that fascinating presentation. Mike Lazine wonders what programming language or languages was used for these tools that you created?
Almost all of these tools were developed in Python, with the exception of the bone mineral density tool and the compression fracture tool. Those were actually developed in C++ by previous researchers at NIH many years ago. And so I worked on those tools, and it was very challenging because the C++ is a really challenging language to understand. Yeah, all the rest of the tools were developed in Python using the PyTorch package for deep learning.
Yes, Python is a much more accessible programming language. Indeed, even I, who am definitely not a computer programmer, have used Python and various statistical packages in there. And Python can be used for programming games as well. So it definitely has a lot of multifaceted applications. Mike Lazine has another question. He wonders, how can we get these AI tools that you made out to a lot of the people in the healthcare industry? And you proposed one model, which is for AI radiology startups to essentially adopt these tools and contract with patients directly. And of course, then the patients have to get all of their medical records from the hospital. Sometimes that is not an easy process, even though one has the right to obtain those records. Going through the hospital bureaucracy and getting people to actually respond to one's request is an entirely different challenge. And I'm wondering, do you foresee any sort of opportunities for integration into healthcare systems of these tools so that patients, especially those who don't have the time or the resources or the persistence, frankly, to request their own records, could still take advantage of these diagnostic possibilities, which are really beyond what standard medical procedures offer right now?
Yeah. Unfortunately, there isn't anything available right now. There is a website which is called Chest X-ray Age, or cxage.org, where you can upload your chest X-ray image and it will predict basically your, what they call, biological age. They developed a system that looks at your biological age, which can be different than your chronological age. So there is a website where you can upload your chest X-ray, and there's also a website from Stanford where you can upload your chest X-ray and it will identify like 5 very common diseases. But other than that, there's nothing really. I'd love to see more stuff like that where AI models are deployed and made available online. If you're just making it available and you're not like selling it, I don't think it needs FDA approval. If you are going to be selling it, then unfortunately you do have to get FDA approval, which is a bit cumbersome. But
That's kind of weird.
I don't think that should be necessary. I think the FDA approval process should exist because it's very useful for doctors to know like whether something has gone through the FDA or not. But I don't believe that the FDA should just prevent people from using AI systems just because it's way too much of a burden on people developing these systems, and also you know, some of these things are just doing basic measurements, and it's similar to what happened with the FDA and 23andMe, where the FDA for a long time prevented 23andMe from basically providing information about their genetic risk factors. Anyway, that was kind of a long-winded answer, but yeah, I hope that there'll be more things available online soon. It is quite hard to get your scans. I have heard that Epic is going to be introducing a feature soon where you could download your scans from their patient gateway system, which is called MyChart. So if that ever happens, that'll basically revolutionize everything, because basically you'll be able to log in and just download your scans. But right now, most hospitals, it's a very cumbersome process, and the hospitals are actually kind of greedy. Like, they don't want to share because they want you to be using their services, right, for all your medical care. They don't want you downloading your scans and then getting, services elsewhere. So they're very reluctant to share. You do have a right to your scans, and it's important that patients understand that they have the right to all their medical data. But unfortunately, the hospitals are often very reluctant to give it, and also the companies that sell the imaging software and the database software for storing the medical images, they don't make it very easy either. So a lot of times the only way to get the scan is to basically burn it onto a CD-ROM. Like, they have a button that just basically you can click that will put it on a CD-ROM, but they don't have any other options. So you end up getting it on a CD-ROM, and unfortunately, like most computers nowadays don't have CD-ROM drives. So it can be very annoying. But I'd like to encourage people to at least try to get their medical scans.
Yes, I think that would be important, at the very least, to establish a culture where people understand that these medical records are theirs legitimately and that they should be entitled to them, and to encourage hospitals to develop more streamlined processes for disclosing those records to patients. Luis Arroyo writes, this is also a top incentive to make stuff for free in this regard, in terms of going around FDA bureaucracy. And I think there is an incentive for this, especially because there are other motives than making money. And I think wealthy individuals need to understand this as well. So let's say a multi-billionaire could be saved or have his life extended by timely diagnoses, but they're not available in the conventional medical system. Perhaps that multi-billionaire could subsidize some AI radiology startups that would accept and analyze many people's data for free, and thereby also improve the quality of the diagnostic technologies. But the payoff for that multi-billionaire would not be in monetary terms. He would be engaging in philanthropy. The payoff would be that his own life could be extended by some of these diagnostic advances. Didier Cornell writes, yes, go ahead.
And also, sort of the most useful thing would be if people could upload both their imaging data and their genetic data, because then you could basically find a lot of genetic correlates with disease states and things like that. But I don't think there's any like large data set right now of both imaging data and genetic data.
You know, so I thought that was kind of weird about the FDA stepping in to that. I mean, isn't it just kind of like the AI is interpreting a picture? I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, if you want to sell it though, you have to go through the FDA, which I don't agree with. There was a very good article from some researchers at Cornell, where they're essentially were arguing that there should be a like basically two paths for selling these AI. One is you get FDA approval. The other is you don't have FDA approval. Part of their argument was that like the FDA just doesn't have the resources to review all of the applications that are coming in. The number of AI tools that are under review at the FDA has been like growing exponentially, and they don't have that much staff. So it's at the point now where the FDA is really slowing the deployment and development of AI tools. So why not just make it available, and with a huge caveat that this is not FDA approved, because fundamentally all it is it's information. Fundamentally it's not much different than, say, going to a doctor or just some random person, like some naturopath or something, and asking them to look at their scans. It's fundamentally it's not really any different. It's just you're having an AI look at it. And I think we allow people to go to see all kinds of alternative medicine people who have no idea what they're talking about. But we allow that because the FDA is not allowed to interfere in the practice of medicine, and they're not allowed to prevent people from speaking their mind or giving their opinion on something that's guaranteed under the First Amendment. So I think it's very similar with AI. You can argue that you have the First Amendment right to listen to what an AI has to say, and then make your own informed opinion on whether you're going to trust that AI or not. Of course, I still think the FDA should exist, and they should do very rigorous reviews, because I think that sort of like stamp of approval is extremely useful for doctors and patients. But I don't think they should just be banning all AI.
Yes, absolutely. It seems that the current framework where all AI systems that are intended for commercial use have to go through FDA approval is far too onerous. This is actually one of those paradoxical situations in which more agency staffing would make the process easier, and certainly having more examiners reviewing applications could lead to faster approvals, provided there's no bias against these systems at the FDA. But I agree with you, Dan. The better approach would be simply not to have these AI applications subject to FDA review, and instead have people essentially access this information with the knowledge that they are responsible for the interpretation of the results. Didier Cornell writes that this is an interesting conversation, and there should be a place where it is possible to share these data, but sadly it does not exist, not in the US, not in Europe, probably not in China. So hopefully that could be rectified, perhaps in an open source collaborative kind of manner where patients will volunteer to share their own data. And indeed, there are services that are working to make this happen. One of them is, of course, CureDAO, with whose founder, Mike Sin, we had a previous virtual Enlightenment Salon. Now I would like to go to Daniel Tweed because he has a number of questions. Please proceed.
Oh, hey, great job, Dan. By the way, I want to start simulcasting these back on the Clubhouse app. I recently getting back into using Clubhouse more. So we have a U.S. Transhumanist Party on Clubhouse if there's anyone that wants to join. So yeah, a few questions. What is the resolution limit of the current CT scan kind of technology?
Well, it depends. It depends on the scanner. So typically, the size of those pixels is about 1 by 1 millimeter.
Okay.
And then the thickness of each slice is like 1 to 3 millimeters. So, and they've been about that. They've been about that resolution for 10 to 15 years. So, they're pretty high resolution.
Yeah, and I guess you can also tell from the density of the image too. Get a lot of detail.
Some of those images that I showed with the kidney stones, they're very high resolution, but they're also very noisy because they're not using a lot of radiation. So that's kind of another factor.
So couldn't we?
They're increasing in resolution over time. There's a newer type of scanner that's called a photon counting CT scanner that's even more high resolution, and so
yeah. Couldn't we go to like medical colleges where they have deceased corpses that are being for anatomic purposes? Couldn't those be CT scanned? No limit on the radiation there, obviously, and then you'd also know what they died of, and you could build a pretty robust, potentially pretty good database from that kind of data. Is that that's
a really interesting suggestion. I really like that suggestion. Economists like Robin Hanson have talked about how like it's really ridiculous that we're not doing a lot of autopsies because there's a lot we can learn from autopsies. One of the challenges, though, I guess with that is just that there's a lot of damage that occurs like post-mortem. So you'd have to factor that in. So for instance, I've heard that a lot that the brain structures kind of deteriorate very quickly after someone dies.
So maybe get a protocol in place.
You could see a lot. I think you could see like how much plaque somebody has in their heart, the size of the heart, like a lot of different things.
So what? Maybe within 5 minutes of the person being coded, try to get them into an imaging device. Is that? Yeah, I mean,
probably the main reason it's not being done is just there's lack of available scanners. Theoretically it could be done, which that would be really interesting and useful.
Another thought that occurred to me is I remember in early school they would show these pictures of smokers' lungs, and it's like, oh my God, look how awful this is. Don't ever smoke. It seems like if maybe that's an entry point for getting a lot of this imaging data more into the public domain. Is it's kind of a scared straight educational program.
Yeah, unfortunately, they don't really focus on risk factors that much. So what happens is that the radiologist may see plaque in the aorta or in the heart, or sometimes they see plaque in mammograms, like inside the breast tissue. They'll see like plaque, atherosclerotic plaque. And so the radiologist will note like plaque in the report. Like they'll just be like a little note, like minor plaque or something. But then what happens is that a lot of times the report doesn't even go to the patient, and the doctor, some of the doctors don't even read that report. And then if they do read it, they may not relay that information to the patient. And then if they do relay that information to the patient, they'll just say like, you have a risk factor. But that doesn't really say much, right? So I think they need to get better at like communicating these risk factors. One of the ways you can do it, which some people think is a bit more effective, is to say like, instead of just saying you have a risk factor, say you have you're say 45 years old, but you have plaque in your heart that we would expect someone who is 70 years old to have. So you can say something like that. And then that's kind of more informative. Or what I would like is if people just used a machine learning model that has been trained a lot of data that would basically say like, you have a chance of dying, like you have a 70% chance of dying in like 10 years. Or maybe you could even plot like a chart showing like your probability of dying like at different ages. So this is all like stuff that we could be doing, but we're not doing right now.
Yes, there certainly are a lot more tools and diagnostic types of results that could be deployed. Now, it's interesting with regard to autopsies, of course, people who are signed up for cryopreservation would not want to have autopsies done on them after their legal deaths. So there does need to be some sort of framework to very clearly protect those rights while also enabling more scientifically beneficial autopsies to be done for people who would otherwise just be buried or cremated, and there wouldn't be any sort of benefit derived from that. Mike Lazine wonders, don't you need consent as well to do autopsies if there are any surviving family members of the person? I believe so, unless it's a crime investigation type of setting, in which case the requirements are a bit more relaxed. But if it's just an autopsy for medical purposes, you do need to be respectful of a person's rights and make sure that they opt in. And Didier says, interesting, if autopsies were systematically performed for all deaths, we would have more murders detected, and after a while, probably fewer murders committed, and therefore slightly longer life. So a kind of systemic improvement if that were the default practice. And also, I would like to give some time for the second topic that Dan was going to discuss today. So I'm going to pose one more of the questions that has been raised on AI for medical imaging. We might be able to return to some of the other questions later. Jason Geringer wonders, can you tell what kidney stones would look like in advance so as to perhaps determine how painful they would be for a person.
Yeah, that's something I would love a warning for. Hey, you got a painful one coming, man. You better bite the bullet, man. Next time you.
Well, that's something I was really interested in because I had read the work of Andres Emelson, who's we all know as founder of the Stanford Transhumanist Association, and he argues that kidney stones are one of the most painful conditions known based on surveys he's done and other stuff. So yeah, I was really interested in, can we predict whether a kidney stone is going to grow, become like very symptomatic, or whether it will just pass spontaneously and without a lot of pain. And there's actually like very little work on this. What we did at NIH was we looked at about 12,000 scans that were taken for CT colonography. So there's a procedure that some people get when they're around 65, where they get a CT scan that looks at their colon, and basically air is inserted into the colon, and you go into a CT scanner and they can basically look at your colon. And so that's an alternative to getting a conventional colonography, which is sort of an invasive procedure where you have to get your colon flushed out, and it's kind of painful and stuff. So anyway, we looked at like 12,000 scans that were taken for CT colonography, and we found that there were kidney stones in about 15% of them. And we believe that most of those kidney stones were asymptomatic. And then, so the question is like, how likely are these asymptomatic stones to become symptomatic? And there's actually very little work on that. I think I only found like one paper on it. And the conventional thinking is that most very small kidney stones actually just get flushed out at some point, and they kind of just pass without causing any pain. But then there's other work showing that people who have these tiny kidney stones are much more likely to get larger stones that cause a lot of pain later in life. So right now, the tiny stones, they're not considered very serious by doctors. And sometimes they're not, I think they're not even really noted, believe it or not. Because just if something's not serious, the radiologists don't mention it because they don't want to scare the patient. But having a very tiny stone in your scan is a huge risk factor, and we can prevent kidney stones just by like drinking more water, not consuming so much salt, things like that. Then there can be larger stones, and some of them actually can be shaped like a staghorn, so they basically have this horn shape. And those are basically, I think, very painful, and they're so large they require surgical removal. So yeah, so they can get really nasty, and you were asking earlier, like in the chat, whether they can be shaped like spiked balls, and they can be. Certain kidney stones, they can be like really spiky.
Yeah,
So,
my brother told me horror stories about he had kidney stones, and yikes. And so I, being the crappy little brother that I am, I wrote a song about it. Sent it to him. That's anyway, it was funny.
Well, if any of our audience members are interested in our conversation with Andres Gomez Emelson, we had a virtual Enlightenment Salon with him on April 18th, 2021. It was actually our longest salon in USTP history. So a fascinating discussion about which experiences are the most painful and which can bring the most happiness, the best hedonic states to humans. Now, we have a comment from Alethea who writes, so many people already just use Google or WebMD for medical questions and get thousands of conflicting answers, often harmful and definitely not peer-reviewed or science-based. So any answers from the AI-based diagnostic services are going to be more reliable and less likely to mislead than what people encounter already routinely on the web. Art Ramon, please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, if there's a company that does digital imaging and they want your code, can they do a FOIA request for it and integrate it as a feature into their software? And then if the FDA is having an application approval bottleneck, can't they also do a FOIA request for their whatever software they use for their approval process and give them an AI enhanced version of that software to make them more efficient? So is it possible for these companies to get a FOIA request and get your code? Because I know it's been possible, like with the Veterans Affairs.
Well, I don't think they could get the code because through a FOIA request, because that's considered like proprietary information. But certainly anything.
It happened at the VA. I know private corporations.
Maybe if it was government developed, then people would have a right to it. So, for instance, all the stuff I developed at NIH, it cannot be commercialized very easily because it was developed within the federal government. Yeah, I'm not sure what happened at the VA, but in general, like if people submit software to the FDA, it's considered proprietary, confidential information. But with a FOIA request, you could get information on the process used for the approval and all the data that was, or at least some of the data that was used to justify the approval. They don't really have like a super standardized process. So I don't think they have software they're using that helps them with the approval itself, but you could definitely get information. However, it would take several years. So like I have a FOIA request to the FDA in May 2021, and I still haven't received any information, and they told me actually it would take another 2 to 3 years. So the total time typically is like 4 or 5 years for any kind of non-trivial request, and then for trivial requests it's like typically about a year or 2 years. So it's very slow.
That just seems like another opportunity to create some AI enhanced tool for their FOIA request also. I mean, there are bottlenecks, and with AI, I mean, these bottlenecks can be addressed. So I guess someone needs to, someone who wants to commercialize and make
it's
profit.
More of a, it's more something that needs to be solved. Legislation. Like there should just be legislation that forces the FDA to just make everything available for the the purpose of public scrutiny and transparency. So I think that that's the solution. But of course, AI can theoretically help with a lot of different things.
Mhm. Yes, having this information available upfront and published by the agency would actually be better for everybody involved. It takes a lot of time and effort to respond to information requests because one has to compile a lot of information from disparate repositories or sometimes even emails that are relevant to the request. So it's better to publish that up front, and that way users can download it. The agency doesn't have to spend time responding to individual requests if it's public information that people have access to by right. But having to wait a few years for a Freedom of Information Act request kind of defeats the purpose of that entire process. So now I think we should proceed to the second part of your presentation, Dan, on long COVID and what you found through your research, through your personal experience. Please tell us about this, because I think this is an issue of interest to numerous individuals. About 1 in 5 Americans, by some measurements, is suffering from some sort of long COVID symptom or has experienced it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, it's a really large topic. I just published 2 posts on Substack, which I've spent a lot of time writing. The first one is on a theory I developed while I was suffering from long COVID, which I call the false alarm theory. This term actually comes from a doctor, Paul Garner, who has written about long COVID and his experience with long COVID. And it's worth pointing out, Paul Garner is not just some random UK doctor. He was involved in the founding of the Cochrane collaboration, which is widely respected for their meta-analyses and very rigorous standards of evidence that they use. And he actually led the infectious disease division of the Cochrane collaboration for many years. He's widely respected for his work on tropical diseases, and he wrote a number of articles in the Guardian about, in British Medical Journal, describing his experience with long COVID. And his experience was very similar to my experience. And so those articles really resonated with me when I was dealing with long COVID. And he talked to a physician in Norway who has developed a theory of long COVID fatigue, where he describes the fatigue as a false alarm. So essentially, it's it's inaccurate. So essentially, your brain is saying that you don't have any energy in your body, but actually you do. So it's very similar to certain types of chronic pain situations where people may complain about back pain, but actually there's actually no damage to their back. So I have written a very detailed post on this whole theory and kind of connecting it with some other ideas. And then I have another post which is going over some psychosomatic factors that may play a role in long COVID. And then I also discuss some biological factors. So yeah, now basically to go back to the beginning, we should discuss how common long COVID is, because there's been a lot of fear mongering and really poor slop questions. So most of the studies that have tried to measure how common long COVID is. They're just based on surveys of COVID patients, and they don't have any control group. So from those studies, sometimes some people will say that like 30% or even 70% of people have, quote, long COVID at 3 months. But a lot of the symptoms that people report and which they attribute to COVID are actually very common. So for instance, brain fog is extremely common. It's like 30%. If you just sample random people, like 30% of them will say they have brain fog. Same thing with fatigue. Fatigue is extremely common. It's like 30, 40%. Sleep disturbance or insomnia is reported in 20 to 30% of random people. Pain is very common. Stomach issues are very common. A lot of these things are extremely common. So you really need a control group to see if there's actually more of these symptoms in people who had COVID. So the studies that actually have a control group, what they find is like at 3 months, it's about 10%, 10 to 15% of people who had COVID have more symptoms. And so then there's another question though, which is how much of this is specific to COVID versus just any viral infection. And there's another paper that came out recently, which seems to indicate that when they looked at people who had gotten COVID versus people who had an upper respiratory viral infection, and they found that basically they had similar levels of symptoms. So it seems that the quote long COVID is not really specific to COVID. It's just a standard sort of thing that occurs with any kind of viral infection. Maybe with some viruses a bit more than others. And so it's the idea that long COVID is like this new diagnostic category or some new scary condition. I don't really think it's true. I think this is type of syndrome that can occur with a lot of different viruses. The most famous one is Epstein-Barr virus. So like people who have Epstein-Barr virus, which is called mono, colloquially, something like 20% of people have symptoms lingering at 3 months, and then maybe 10% at 6 months, and then a small percentage have symptoms that persist for many, many years. So so basically, if you want, I can go into the there are basically 3 things I kind of want to discuss: the false alarm theory, other psychosomatic symptoms, and then biological effects.
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. Well, I guess I'll start with the biological causes of long COVID. And so I've looked into this a little bit, and there's a lot of different theories. The one that I find the most convincing is Epstein-Barr reactivation. And in my second post, in the appendix, I linked to a lot of different articles on this. So I think there's the most research supporting this particular idea out of all the different ideas that have been proposed for long COVID. In one of those papers, they actually had a control group, and they found that the long COVID patients who had Epstein-Barr reactivation had quite a a lot more symptoms. So I found that pretty convincing. Another interesting thing was some of the three major symptoms that they found that were more common were sleep issues, insomnia, fatigue, and tinnitus, which is ringing of the ears. And those are symptoms that I had in August. Basically all through August, I had very extreme insomnia, where I was only sleeping 3 to 5 hours a night. And then I had extreme fatigue, where I could not walk more than, say, a block. And then I also had the ringing in my ears. Now, at the time, I thought the ringing in my ears was just due to the insomnia and stress level on my body, but I actually think it could have been Epstein-Barr reactivation. In 2019, I had fairly bad fatigue for about 6 months. That was unexplained. And at the time, I had my I had myself checked for Epstein-Barr virus, and there was some evidence of Epstein-Barr reactivation. So it's something I think I've experienced in the past, and I think I probably experienced it again with my long COVID experience. There's other viruses that some research is that can also be reactivated, like cytomegalovirus and some herpes virus. But the main one seems to be this Epstein-Barr virus. So then, as far as other biological contributors, obviously, if you had a severe COVID, you could have organ damage. So especially in patients that are hospitalized, they can have permanent scarring of their lungs. I don't think I had anything like that. I actually had a chest x-ray that was done in August, which showed my lungs were very healthy. I had very intense pain in my chest all through August, but I believe that was just due to inflammation of the muscles, due to a lot of coughing in July. And once the muscles in between the ribs become inflamed, it's very difficult for that to heal because you're constantly moving. So basically, that was an issue I had all through August. But I don't think I had any permanent organ damage. I think permanent organ damage is pretty unlikely if you've been vaccinated, and it's really only going to occur if you had really severe COVID. Another biological factor would be so-called microplaques. I haven't done a lot of research on that, but it seems that could be a factor. And then the other one that I think is possible is just lingering virus. But there's not a lot of really good data on that. There are autopsy studies on patients who had COVID where they found virus like 6 months after they had COVID. But it's not clear like if that virus was actually causing any symptoms. And actually in some of these studies, they say very specifically that the patients were not experiencing any COVID symptoms. So it seems that you can have some virus lingering around and it's not really causing a lot of problems. So I'm kind of skeptical of that whole theory. I think it could be a factor in some patients, but I don't think it's like the dominant cause of long COVID. I'm open to my mind being changed. I think we need more research, but I have a hard time seeing it being like a dominant factor. And then there's other biological causes that people talk about, such as immune system deregulation, and things like that. If you look at a lot of the papers on immune system deregulation in long COVID, some of them actually say that they think it's because of the latent virus reactivation. So, yeah, I don't know if that's how big of a causal factor that would be. And then there's also a lot of other theories that just don't have any scientific evidence to support them. So, for instance, a lot of people online think it's due to like histamine release or mast cell activation, and there's no evidence for that. A lot of people are taking Benadryl to try to help with long COVID, and it can help you sleep. Like if you take Benadryl in the evening, it can help you sleep, but there's no evidence that Benadryl is going to help with long COVID. Yeah, so what I discuss in the second post is, or really in both these posts, is psychosomatic effects. The way I define psychosomatic is just something that arises in the brain. So it doesn't mean it's a psychological issue necessarily. Psychological issues would be a subset of psychosomatic issues, but psychosomatic is a much more general term. So in the second post, I talk about some pretty common things people generally are aware of, like depression, insomnia, and anxiety, right? But what I don't think a lot of people realize is that the degree to which these psychological problems can cause physical issues in the body. So for instance, with depression, people think that it's just feeling sad, hating yourself, complaining a lot, like that sort of thing. But actually, severe depression causes a lot of problems in the body and a lot of somatic symptoms. So it can cause fatigue, obviously. It can cause aches, muscle aches. It can cause upset stomach and cramps in your bowel. It can cause hyper activation of your sympathetic nervous system and stress. So I just feel like in general, people aren't aware of a lot of the physical symptoms of depression. And same thing with insomnia and anxiety. So I was just discussing a lot of these because I think what happens with a lot of long COVID patients is they've read about the biological causes, and so they rush off to a doctor and get a lot of tests done. And then the doctor tells them, oh, you're fine. And they feel like gaslighted because they haven't, because they're suffering all these different symptoms. Where in reality, a lot of these symptoms are coming from anxiety, depression, insomnia. And so I think it's a big problem. Now, some people think that you shouldn't think that there's a kind of the opposite problem where people are they're like going to a psychologist for depression whereas actually they have a biological condition, and that's another problem that can occur. But I actually think the first problem is bigger. So I think there's a bigger problem of people going to a doctor for psychological issues than vice versa. And so then there's another psychosomatic cause for long COVID fatigue, which isn't really psychological. It operates more subconsciously, and that's the false alarm theory. And that theory is a little bit, I ended up writing a whole article on it. And so what happened was I read this book that was called Endure, which is about long distance running. And they talk about something called the central governor. And essentially that's a model that in your brain of your body's energy state. So there's been a lot of research on why runners get fatigued. And in the early 1900s, they thought it was due to lactic acid buildup in the muscles. And that's only part of the story. One of the things that can't be explained by like the lactic acid theory or other similar theories is that when runners are running in a race, when they get close to the finish line, they tend to speed up. And that's kind of surprising, because if the runners are running as hard as possible, like, why do they just suddenly speed up at the end? Like, why do they get this burst of energy at the very end of the race? And to explain that, this central governor theory was invented. And basically what this theory says is that there's a fatigue is generated by a model in your brain that's running, that's trying to simulate how much energy you have left. And the fatigue is generated to prevent you from damaging your body. So it's to prevent like permanent damage to your muscles and organs that would occur, like if you, for instance, had a ton of lactic acid buildup, or your blood sugar and oxygen were getting really low. So there's this theory that this model is modeling like how much energy you have in reserve, and then basically generating fatigue and kind of like predicting things into the future as well. So anyway, it's a little bit hard to explain but I try to explain this in the post. And so the false alarm theory is that when patients with long COVID, this model can get out of whack, and essentially it is generating this fatigue, which is out of line with biological reality. This could occur if, say, the model it shifts when you get COVID. So when you initially get COVID, obviously you have much less energy, and that's because your body's using a lot of energy to fight off the virus. So naturally you feel fatigue because you have less energy. But then what could happen is that even after the virus goes away and everything returns to normal, this model in the brain still is operating under the impression that you have COVID, essentially. So it hasn't adjusted to the new reality that you no longer have COVID. And this is very similar to what happens sometimes in people who have like fractures or broken bones, is that the damage will heal, but then the brain doesn't update. So there's still like a lot of pain being generated, for instance. In general, like this sort of thing is called functional neurological disorder. So functional neurological disorder is a very broad category, but a lot of functional neurological disorder is this sort of thing where the brain has a certain model it's using that's no longer accurate. And so it's generating pain, it's generating these symptoms that are just based on a faulty model. So this sort of thing really like kind of made a lot of sense to me. And it suggests one way you can treat this sort of condition would be like just through gradual restoration of activity and exercise, which itself is very controversial. It sounds kind of crazy that exercise would be controversial, and I think like among like doctors, it's not controversial, but online and among like people in the long COVID community, exercise is very controversial. So I discussed some of that in the article as well. But I think I'll stop there since we only have like 25 minutes, and I'll take any questions people have.
Yes, thank you very much, Dan, for that presentation. And it is quite enlightening to delve into potential neurological or psychosomatic causes for certain long COVID symptoms. And I know that for me, once my cardiac MRI showed no damage to the heart, no scarring, no past myocarditis, structurally the heart was fine, I felt comfortable in returning to my former exercise regimen. Now, I'm not as fast as I used to be, but for instance, over the course of this past week, I was able to run 10 miles the day after running 6.5 miles. And then 2 days later, I ran 7.25 miles. And my resting heart rate did not increase afterward. And I'm noticing that my heart rate is behaving more normally as I have continued to run. I think one of my fears when I was 3-4 months into the long COVID experience was that when I started to run, all of a sudden my heart rate would rise into the high 160s or 170s in terms of beats per minute. And this is unusual for an endurance athlete. Usually when you're running at a moderate pace, your heart rate will be in the 130s, 140s, sometimes in the 150s, but 170s would be corresponding to extreme physical effort. So the fear of that happening and the implications of that made me pull back every time I tried running, or I would do like a run walk type of sequence. And what I should have done, not right away after having COVID, but perhaps 2 or 3 months after I tested negative for COVID, was to essentially continue running every day. And I realized what happened was my heart had been deconditioned. So the first time I would run after a long period of inactivity, yes, the heart rate would be higher than I was used to. The second time it would be a little bit more typical. The third time it would be even more typical. And now when I run, I would say my heart rate behaves fairly normally. Now, that's not to say that all symptoms have subsided, but there is an element of exercise that could be quite helpful. But what I'm wondering is, can functional neurological disorder or some sort of psychosomatic element explain not just fatigue, but other symptoms, say chest pains when there's no obvious physical damage to the heart or to the lungs?
Yeah, I don't think any of this is very well understood, but I don't see why not. So the brain is essentially where pain is generated. So people have this simplistic model that like there's these pain sensors, and when something is when these pain sensors are activated, you feel pain. But actually, whether or not a sensation is painful is determined by structures in the brain that are modeling like what's going on. So people have a hard time understanding this fact, but this can be seen, like, for instance, in the there's something called rubber hand delusion. Where I don't know if people have seen this, but the experimenter has this the patient's hand on the table, and they have this rubber hand, and by the patient's actual hand is covered up, but they can see this rubber hand on the table. And then by touching the rubber hand and touching the patient's hand at the same time, the brain starts to get tricked into thinking that the rubber hand is your actual hand. So then you can actually, if you start to like poke at this rubber hand, you can actually cause sensations of pain, because the brain is modeling that the rubber hand is your actual hand. So that just shows like how the brain generates pain. Another example, which is a little more kind of like woo or not really scientifically studied, is hypnosis. People have claimed that hypnosis can be used to treat pain by basically suggesting like, actually, to the brain, like, actually your body's okay, you don't need to be in pain, things like that. It sounds kind of crazy, but there's a lot of reports of that. So yeah, the brain basically interprets sensory signals based on the way it's modeling things. Anyway, so yeah, so to get to your point, it could cause pain. Now, as far as the issue of higher heart rate, some of that could just be from deconditioning. So, and some of it could be from anxiety, and some of it could just be from issues with your monitoring device, right? Like, didn't you find that there was some like spurious readings coming off
Yes.
the device?
Which is why I wear 3 monitoring devices now when I run. I have the Fitbit, I have the Garmin, and I have a Frontier X2 monitor, which I can attach to my chest, and that can give the most accurate measurement of heart rate as well as breathing rate, for instance, and even a live ECG. And yes,
like I found like when I was going back to the gym in January for the first time, like I really had to recalibrate things, because my body was, it had changed. Like, I had deconditioned a lot, so I was not capable of doing the same kind of sets as I was previously. And you can easily overexert yourself when you're recovering from long COVID. So it's something to be aware of, and so that's why some people do like heart rate tracking and things, but it has its own issue. Yeah.
Yes. Well, thank you for that response, and hopefully this will help some people who are experiencing long COVID symptoms and seek to recover from them. And wished to find something that they could do, even though a lot of mainstream medical practice would just not really have any suggestions for them other than doing the diagnostic tests to rule out organ damage, which I think should be done. I think people need to
Yeah,
have
yeah,
the comfort
that's a
level.
great point, Gennady. I think it is useful. So I think you just made two great points. The first is that the doctors are not going to be able to help you with long COVID. I spoke to two doctors. They did not help me at all. They basically just said rest, try to ease back into exercise, eat healthy, sleep more, basic stuff like that. They had nothing else to say. There's no the science has just not developed that enough. And then the other point is it is useful to get organ damage ruled out. I think it's very unlikely for people who had mild cases, but it's useful to get it ruled out just for peace of mind. So I had a EKG and a cardiovascular function test done in October, where basically I ran on a treadmill, and they had like an EKG device, and those EKGs are way more accurate than like the smartwatches, because they have multiple electrodes and they're getting a much clearer signal. So that ruled out like any kind of damage to the heart or lungs, and that was quite useful, because then it was reassuring, and also just going through the process of running on the treadmill helped me get over some of the anxiety I had about exercise. So yeah, so I definitely recommend that if people are dealing with long COVID.
Yes, indeed. So we have time for a few more questions. Let's go to Tom Ross.
Yeah, I think peace of mind is the key here. I think even this salon and talking about it is extremely helpful, because it is the psychosomatic part. Is really important if people understand. So a lot of this could be anxiety, as you said, the false alarm thing. I'm going to read your posts now, and even understanding lactic acid. I mean, a lot of people, one of the big lies about it is that it's produced by the muscles during exercise, but it's actually it's produced to soothe the muscles, to soothe the depolarization that happens in muscles during exercise. And so just knowing things like that, just the knowledge is really a way to abate the anxiety that would come, the false alarms, the concerns. I do a thing, it's kind of the opposite of the rubber hand thing, where if I stub my toe or I hit my finger or get a paper cut or something, I immediately eventually or really quickly I focus on the other finger or the other toe in in my bilateral body, and I immediately start thinking about how good that finger feels or how good that toe feels, and it just takes my mind off of the other thing, and it immediately kind of just, the whole pain thing abates. It's about focusing the brain on what's working rather than what doesn't. So I've been doing that for some time, and it really works.
Well, that's another whole thing I didn't really even get into, which is when you focus on certain things, you tend to magnify them in your head. So yeah, like and to be clear, the false alarm fatigue, it's not saying it's due to anxiety. But anxiety can be a big issue. And one of the issues is just that you tend to focus on sensations in your body and just worry about them too much. So like, for instance, when you're exercising, it's normal for it to be kind of uncomfortable, right? It's normal to feel aches in your muscles, for instance. especially if you haven't exercised for a month or two. And so just recognizing that's normal, it's not life-threatening, is helpful, because it's very easy to get anxiety that there's some weird post-exertional thing going on, or some weird long COVID issue, when reality is it's just a normal thing, right? And especially with a lot of the fear mongering in the media, it's very easy to get anxiety.
Yes, well, one sees reports in the media of healthy people essentially dropping dead, athletes dropping dead on the field. And there are some who allege this is due to vaccines. I don't believe that. I do think they may have had some sort of COVID-related damage, but they also were exerting themselves to far more extreme extents than most of us would when we exercise. Now, Daniel Tweed wonders, what is the mechanism for the brain to update the body image? And I think this would be a great question to conclude our salon.
I don't think it's understood, and because I've read a little bit about functional neurological disorder, and I haven't seen anything about why some people get it whereas some people don't get it. So I don't think it's understood at all. So some people, when they have a broken bone or something, everything will be healed, but then they still can't operate the limb. And so that's a common type of functional neurological disorder. And so for instance, maybe someone hurt their arm and then everything's healed, but they still can't move their arm. And they know that the doctors often, they can like get the arm to move by like, doing something where you kind of unconsciously like flinch your arm. And so they know like the arm can move, but the patient can't move their arm. Like they can't move it. And this can be very frustrating for patients, because they might go to some doctors and they'll tell them, hey, your arm is fine. But if they go to a neurologist, likely they will be diagnosed with functional neurological disorder. And I don't think they have any idea why this happens in some patients, but it does.
Yes, I think it is essential to study these kinds of mechanisms in greater detail to try to give patients who are experiencing these symptoms and these limitations a way out, if there's something they can do in terms of a daily regimen, some habits that they could adopt to gradually recondition their nervous system to align with the objective physical reality. I think that could aid a lot of people. And I would say it should be a relief to people when they find out that there's no organ damage or their blood tests are normal, because that indicates that the condition is reversible. And it's a question of, can we figure out a pathway for that particular individual to reverse it? So thank you very much, Dan.
And most of these things are treatable. So
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. And I think we do need to focus on this issue, because especially as I think a lot of people unjustifiably are putting this pandemic out of their minds, many other people are still suffering from it and are at risk of reinfection, which is the big concern with COVID, because essentially virtually all of us have had COVID once. Some have had it multiple times, but studies do show the more times one contracts COVID, the likelier it is that serious damage will arise. So preventing that, as well as helping the patients who are suffering from long-term effects, would be essential to truly overcome this pandemic as a society. So thank you very much, Dan, for 2 fascinating presentations today. I think our audience really enjoyed the in-depth exploration both of AI for medical imaging and the long COVID findings that I think could help a lot of people on their path to recovery. And thank you to our panel. Thank you to our audience, as usual, for the thoughtful commentary. And I hope that we can all live long and prosper.